So striving to be European, he says, and black requires some specific forms of double consciousness. And he says, by saying this, I do not mean to suggest that taking on either or both of these unfinished identities necessarily exhausts the subjective responses of any particular individual. However, where racist, nationalist, or ethnically absolutist discourses orchestrate political relationships so that these identities appear to be mutually exclusive, you can't be black and French. Occupying the space between them or trying to demonstrate the continuity has been viewed as a provocative and even oppositional act of political insubordination. One of the important things I liked about Gilroy as well was his emphasis on culture, on art, and I could see, of course, within Indigenous Australia, how important the emerging world of culture and art, making use of the forms of modernity, was in producing possibly the national identity, the sense of a pan-Aboriginal consciousness, which the cultural nationalists had striven for with their writing, with their manifestos. I'm just now going to talk about one other figure who is obviously very important to Gilroy, and when I read The Black Atlantic, I was impressed with the way in which he could actually resituate someone who'd fallen, I guess, had been neglected, but also explain what the latter part of their career really meant. And this is the African-American novelist Richard Wright. Wright, from 1946 onwards, was essentially in self-imposed exile in Europe, living in France. So in The Black Atlantic, Gilroy engages in the defence and an exposition of the late works of Wright. He talks about how Wright's exile, self-imposed, was seen as a betrayal of his authenticity as a black man from the South in America, and how his later works represented how he was seduced by philosophical traditions outside of his narrow ethnic compass. How is it that you, a black American man who grew up in the South, are now interested in European philosophy in terms of thinking about the condition of black people in modernity? And he relates an anecdote which obviously has existed, and I think it's one that Gilroy has often referred to, and it's odd that it was neglected, but he sees the full meaning of this exchange. And it involves C.L.R. James, the author of The Black Jacobins and the classic book on cricket Beyond the Boundary. And James is visiting Wright in France, in his home. And Wright shows him into a room where there are all these volumes of philosophy, and he points to some books by the Danish theosopher Kierkegaard, and he says, "Look here, Nello," and Nello was the nickname that James was known by. "Look here, Nello. You see those books there? Everything that he writes in those books I knew before I had them." And C.L.R. James notes of this exchange, having been a black man in the US had given him, that is Wright, an insight into what today is the universal opinion and attitude, and he italicises this, the universal opinion and attitude of the modern personality. Without labouring, Wright emphasises this connection. What is it? And he goes on to say we should think about it. What was it that Richard Wright found in these works that corresponded with his own experiences? Not necessarily as a black man living in France, but as a black man living in the southern part of the United States in the 1930s. And the suggestion that out of this, of course, becomes a wider problem of the, to use that term, Negro. The African who becomes a Negro inserted in modernity. What does it tell us? What does it challenge us to do? To rethink the things we take as givens. I'm going to move on now to talk about this concept. It sounds good, interplanetary humanism. And I guess before that, it's really important to note there's certainly a very affective quality to a lot of Gilroy's best writing. He's written, I think, the most insightful, incisive works which look at why young men, and in this particular case, the shoe bomber, Richard Reid, why such young men are attracted to extremist Islam. And the notion of community, of connectedness, which is that so-called community, though it exacts a very high price, offers these men. It offers them also, in Gilroy's terms, a sort of ascesis. And Gilroy is actually, to some extent, cynical about the way that black entertainment, we can think of the rapper Jay-Z, in a sense, they're so much part of corporate America and continue to circulate and commodify absurd versions of black urban culture for the rest of us. Think about interplanetary humanism and why it's important to me is because I believe there's an important stream in Aboriginal art, and I call that simply Aboriginal humanism. We could just call it humanism, but of course we're talking about Aboriginal artists. Here, of course, I'm thinking of people like Jack Davis, the plays of Jack Davis, the music of Archie Roach and Jimmy Little and Kev Carmody, and it's based simply, of course, on the fact that we must have shared human concerns, which means that we can communicate that the situation of Aboriginal people in Australia, historical situations, can, through art, be conveyed and carried across to people who don't know them directly. And the notion of humanism in Gilroy occurs in sort of fleeting ways, I suppose, and it's one of those things he never quite develops or tells exactly what it means in some cases. But I'm going to take a couple of quotes. He says, "The recurrence of pain, disease, humiliation and loss of dignity, grief, and the care for those one loves can all contribute to an abstract sense of a human similarity, powerful enough to make solidarities based on cultural particularity appear suddenly trivial." And of course, the critical thing is to balance this off with the fact that those particularities of race and everything that is freighted with them still remain. The fact that Jack Davis wrote No Sugar, that it toured around Australia, of course didn't change the situation of the Nyungar people in Western Australia in any direct way. There was never any reason why they would say we're not Nyungar anymore, we're simply human beings. He says some other features of this humanism can be enumerated. And he calls it a radically non-racial humanism, which exhibits a concern with the forms of human dignity that race thinking strips away. He says it's counter-anthropological and sometimes misanthropic. It's actually not the humanism of I love everyone, it's actually sometimes a humanism of despair, of individuals, of those who are homeless. It's most powerfully articulated where it has been accompanied by a belated return to consideration of the chronic tragedy, vulnerability and frailty that has defined our species. And oddly, he goes on to identify four figures, and it's interesting to think about what the connection is. He says he finds us in the melancholic art of diverse poetic figures from Leopardi, Nietzsche, Esther Phillips and Donny Hathaway. So we have two African-American musicians, a 19th century writer and essayist in Leopardi, a philosopher in Nietzsche. And I suppose they're all marked by the unhappiness of their lives in some cases. They ended tragically, or they were unhappy. Their destinies were unhappy. They were people of extreme sensitivity who obviously couldn't reconcile themselves to the situation which we all accept so complacently as normal. Esther Phillips was a lifelong heroin addict Donny Hathaway committed suicide. Leopardi's life, of course, is marked by unhappy passions and a debilitating physical illness, and Nietzsche, of course, ended in an asylum. He says the mark of this humanism is provided by a grim determination to make that predicament of a fundamentally fragile, corporeal existence into the key to a humanism that contradicts the triumphal tones of the anthropological discourses that were enthusiastically supportive of race thinking in early times. Elsewhere, he talks about this form of humanism as an agonistic, a humanism of conflict, a planetary humanism capable of comprehending the universality of our elemental vulnerability to the wrongs we visit upon each other. He goes on to say that the most valuable sources for enumerating such a humanism is in what he calls a cross-cultural approach to the history and literature of extreme situations. And in these situations, the boundaries of what it meant to be human were being tested and negotiated minute by minute. And that's about as far as he goes with that. But once again, as I say, to me, he's an intuitive thinker. The ideas are tantalising. Where does it go? How does it relate to our own Aboriginal humanists? What sort of profundities are there? Think about someone like Archie Roach, not just his music, the way he carries himself, the sort of aesthetics he employs through his body, through the way he dresses, through the way he speaks. What does it tell us? A sort of lighter concept from Gilroy, the notion of conviviality. And people wonder sometimes just what he means by it or how serious it is. It's essentially, I suppose, a recognition that sometimes something works. Some years ago I read an essay by Stuart Hall about the early immigration of Jamaican workers to Great Britain. He's looking at photographs and he says somehow something worked. In spite of the official discourses of race, between individuals, something works. And Gilroy sees music, of course, we might extend it to an Australian situation, of Aboriginal art and culture generally, as a vehicle for what he might call the politics of transfiguration, of transfiguring our lives, our socialities. Qualitatively different desires, new desires, social relations, and modes of association within the racial community. Between communities as well, between communities which have been opposed to each other, between the oppressed, the formerly oppressed and their former oppressors. And he talks about the formation of a community needs. Now, I believe I've seen this in operation in some places. Sometimes you see it in certain festivals. The Festival of Dreaming, which is held in Woodford in Queensland every year, having been now for a number of years, and it seems to me that over a period of time a certain ethics has been established. The people who convene it, particularly the director of the festival, Rhoda Roberts, have in a sense guided people. Not only have they guided settler people, but also Aboriginal people. It's not a place where we as Aboriginals should feel that every settler who goes there is an ignorant person whom we can work out on. We come, all of us, with the desire that we can produce a new community. There's a range of art and performance, some but not very good, but it's the whole entity of the festival which is important. And when I mentioned earlier that Gilroy talks of his love for England, which is sort of ambivalent. I call him a black Englishman. It is one of the things that he sees in English life. He calls it multiculture, not multiculturalism, the meeting of cultures, of many cultures, an ordinary feature of life in so many parts of Great Britain. It's a way to think about diversity, to recognise it without legislating it. And the everyday experience of conviviality is living with human difference, with social and cultural difference, without, of course, feeling threatened by it, by being possibly drawing on aspects of it. In a way, of course, they can remember those sort of crude racial determinations insignificant and inessential. We see this, of course, in some younger Australians. Those categories of race start to become less essential. Sometimes you're worried if you're close to younger people that maybe they just don't get it. Race is serious. There are races. Races have power. There are racist police. But, they're emerging into a new Australian society in some cases. Now, I'm going to conclude with a discussion of Leopold Sédar Senghor, the first president of Senegal. A great biography of Senghor titled Black, French and African, which sort of sums up the man's complexity, a poet, an administrator, and I suppose a man who, in a sense, preserves Senegal as a democracy, where there are peaceful transitions in power. It's a society of multicultures. There are numerous ethnic groups, there are innumerable languages. I understand that one particular language is becoming dominant, but that's an organic process, not something that's being engineered. And he was also a Catholic in a Muslim country. So Senghor was captured by German troops, I guess some who would have been card-carrying Nazis. He was saved from a racist massacre by the intervention of a French officer, and notwithstanding the fact that he was an intellectual, he was put into a prison camp by the Germans for colonial troops. So he was there with other men from Africa, men who hadn't had the advantages of his education. And he found solace, he said, in the songs and the stories of these troops, but also in reading classic works of European high culture. And while he improved his German and then got on with the business, in the 2 years he was interned reading Goethe. And it was Goethe and the reading of his works that for him crystallised what he called this complex commingling, the various aspects of his personality, the double consciousness, which should have been a fraught question, became for Senghor a blessing. And Gilroy writes of this, of people like Gilroy, of other black men and possibly black women, but these were black men who found themselves caught up by the Nazis, the barbarism of Europeans. He says, their complex consciousness of the dangers of camp thinking or of conformist thinking, and their understanding of the antitoxins that can be discovered and celebrated in crossing cultures, mixing and moving between, provide important resources which today's post-colonial peoples will require if we are to weather the storms ahead. These, in Gilroy's terms, black witnesses to European barbarity. Now, of course, if we just reflect on that, we see it's possibly not so much the post-colonial people, but the dominant majorities who are threatened, who are challenged, who are enticed by the siren songs of racists. We've seen that in Australia. We've seen the vulnerability of so many people. In Gilroy's terms, we see the corrosive effects of a formal politics, the corrosive values of economic rationality, and the resurging power of racism and racialised language. Will our future be our past? And certainly for those people who were in Australia prior to the election of the Rudd government may well have thought that we saw things which we thought we'd never see again for people of my generation. Now, I'm just going to conclude by reading a poem by a man called Tom Murray. It was written down in the Gilroy dialect. I believe it was translated by the great linguist R.M.W. Dixon. And it's called Shifting Camp. So it comes from within the traditional Aboriginal world, but it's also a poem of modernity. It speaks to people who are refugees, who have been cut adrift by changing economic circumstances, who in a sense are cut adrift by modernity, the loss of the values which were provided unproblematically for so many people by religion, what replaces them, but also how they live on, how they survive. So this poem, Shifting Camps, is about a traditional time when a young man who couldn't marry within his own tribe might capture a woman from another tribe. And a young woman, she would grow up in that camp, but she would also have a form of double consciousness. She would speak the language in which she grew up as a child, the language of the people she's actually become assimilated into. And he uses the symbol of the scrub hen, which makes huge nests. It rakes up leaves and it incubates its eggs, dragging leaves for its nest, calling out after nest building. As daylight fades from the north, the scrub hen, travelling far, as daylight fades from the north, the scrub hen, travelling far, shakes the branches of the fig tree. Women like the tree bear fruit, talk Yidney all the time. Strangers who scarcely recall their parents' tongue, crossing borders, travelling on. Crossing borders, travelling on. They speak Yidney with one voice, and Mamu with another. So the two languages, the two consciousnesses. Now, we've done a reading and discussion of some limited aspects of Phenon from within the context of Australian Indigenous studies. I suppose the point I want to conclude with, of course, is that the things that we as Aboriginal people might take as referring to our own situation, might use in thinking about our futures, are of course the very things that the majority, the settlers, the people who have power, should appropriate as well. And like Gilroy, I'm very much at home in Australia. I'm not ambivalent about it. Certainly far more comfortable with the problems we have here and the possibility of solution than I would be in a place like the United States as well. And on that matter, I'll conclude.